Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I am Anisha Jayadevan and I'll be hosting today's discussion. So just a few housekeeping announcements before we start. I request all of you to keep your audio and your video off. This discussion will be for 1 hour and 30 minutes and we'll try and take a small break in the middle. We'll also take all our questions at the end for about 15 to 20 minutes where you can type your questions in the chat window. So let me start with a quick introduction to Cafe Oikos. It's an ongoing series of public talks on ecology and conservation. We used to hold it in public spaces in Bengaluru, but now given the lockdown, we've taken the talks online. And we've been so happy to see that it's much more accessible this way. There are 5 people who voluntarily drive Cafe Oikos. There's Manini Bansal, Ishika Ramakrishna, Janavi Rajan, Shishi Rao, and me. So I'll start today. I'm so happy to have with me a very diverse panel to talk about the links between the coronavirus pandemic and ecosystem health. There's been a lot of media attention on the wet markets of China and on bats as causes of the coronavirus pandemic. But scientists have actually been warning about the next big pandemic for many years now because of habitat loss and increased urbanization that is occurring world over. So this is the backdrop against which we're going to have today's discussion, where we'll be digging deeper into the causes of zoonotic diseases and how they've played out in India and the ways forward for research in this field. So I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Ramakrishanan, who is a molecular ecologist and conservation geneticist working at the National Center for Biological Sciences. We have Dr. Parvathy Venugopal, who has joined us all the way from the UK. She recently finished her PhD at the University of Bristol, where she worked on bat taxonomy. We have Dr. Prashanth, who is a medical doctor and public health researcher at the Institute of Public Health, Bengaluru. Prashanth's interests lie in One Health and health inequities. And he often goes by the nickname Doctor, which is the Kannada way of addressing a doctor. And finally, we have Dr. Mudassar Chanda, who is a research scientist at the National Institute of Veterinary Epidemiology and Disease Informatics in Bengaluru. His research focus is on the epidemiology of livestock diseases in India. So thank you all for being here today. And just a disclaimer before we start that the views discussed here are personal and don't represent the institutions or the organizations at which the panelists work. So let's start with a barrage of questions for Uma. So Uma, could you run us through how zoonotic diseases typically emerge? The novel coronavirus has taught everyone that contact with wildlife through wet markets is one way, but what are some of the other ways? And the second part of the question is, are we seeing more zoonotic diseases in the recent past, and can we expect to see more of them in the future? Over to you, Uma.
Thank you. Thanks, Anisha, and thanks for having me. It's nice to be part of this panel. So this is something which is, I think, probably on everyone's mind, is trying to understand why this has happened. The question you alluded to is a little bit more on how. So how has this happened, right? So I'll start talking first about why, and then maybe we can think about how a little bit more. So when we want to break this down from a scientific perspective, I guess when a disease emerges, it's one of those events which just happens, right? So what we can do is we can try to look across the world and compile many studies. Such research is called meta-analyses. We can compile existing records of when disease emergence happened, when zoonoses emerged into human populations, and try and categorize what is common about all of those situations. And when you do this kind of a meta-analysis, it's like post hoc, after the disease has emerged, what you find is that the strongest predictors of disease emergence are high mammal biodiversity, high species richness of mammals. That's why you tend to have many of these events in the tropics. High human population density, also a very strong correlate, as well as high human land use. So human-induced change of habitats is also very strongly correlated with disease emergence. So I think that these things are, of course, these are very general correlates, right? And from this perspective, for example, India is potentially a hotspot because we have high mammal diversity, high human population density, and very, very high land use change. Now, the other thing you asked, though, in the beginning was that, this particular disease we think emerged from a wet market. And that's basically, in a sense, that's just it's almost like a chance that it happened in that particular space. I guess all diseases, all zoonoses would emerge from any human wildlife contact, right? That would be the means for them to emerge. And when there's a high level of contact, or when there are high interfaces where species who have not seen each other before are coming into contact extensively, then that's basically when zoonoses tend to jump from one host to the other. They could even be jumping from wildlife to domestic animals, right? Not necessarily only to humans. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer, but basically when you have these situations of non-equilibrium where there's a lot of change, there's a change in the community, and new species are seeing each other, the pathogen is seeing a new species for the first time, it can actually jump. But in this particular case with the coronavirus, there seems to be some evidence, SARS-CoV-2, that there has been selection on the coronavirus in humans, because the sequence of the coronavirus in humans is a bit distinct from the one potentially which is its ancestor in bats, right? So it could be, we don't know for sure, it could be that there was selection. It has kind of spilled over into humans multiple times, and there was selection in humans, and a specific strain which was successful in humans is what has become this pandemic. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks. So now let's turn to Parvathy. So the Nipah virus is still fresh in people's minds, especially in India. And just to remind everyone, this virus crosses over from fruit bats to humans, and most recently did so in Kerala in 2018. We also know that bats are reservoirs for many coronaviruses, and that the novel coronavirus likely jumped to an intermediary species from a bat and then jumped to humans. So, Parvathy, could you tell us about bats as reservoirs for viruses and why there is so much transmission of diseases from bats to other animals?
Okay, cool. Thanks, Anisha. I hope everyone can hear me. Hope everyone is doing really good at this crazy time. So before answering what Anisha has asked, I would like to bring or share some background facts about bats very quickly. Most of our listeners might already know this, so excuse me if I am repeating stuff. Bats are very special, well, at least for people, those who are studying them, or people, those who are interested in them, because bats are the only mammals that is capable of powered flight. And as we know, bats constitute about 1/5 of the total mammal diversity. As of the latest figure, we do have 1,421 bat species all around the world. And moreover, they offer us many intangible services in terms of pollination, helping in seed dispersal, keeping pests in control, and the list goes on. However, unfortunately, bats possess a mysterious image among common public in many parts of the world, and India is not different. And this situation gets worsened when such pandemics occur, or especially during such disease outbreaks. And the main reason for that is, as you said, bats host many viruses, and we know this fact for years. Some of these viruses are lethal to bats itself, for example, rabies. But many of the viruses that bats carry can coexist with bats without causing any damage to them. Example, SARS-like coronaviruses or Ebola viruses or Nipah viruses. And that is because of their unique immune system, which is evolved through their ability to fly. And I think we will come to that later during this discussion by Uma, how the evolution happens. So here, what we need to remember is that not all the bat species in the world, or what we are having in India, because the number is 100, more than 120 species we have in India. Not all these bat species carry all these viruses, meaning this bat virus association is very species specific. And that's the reason why we've been in our country, like India, we've been coexisting with bats for so many years peacefully until very recently, before the Nipah or this outbreaks came into the picture. So now the other question is whether bats carry more viruses which can categorize into zoonotic viral category, that means which can infect humans, than any other mammals. Luckily, a recent study came out last month which sheds light into this aspect. And what researchers found is that the proportion of zoonotic viruses is the same among all the mammal categories. Or if I put that in other words, what is that meaning by is, yes, we have many viruses in bats simply because there are many species of bats out there, and not because they are inherently dangerous to humans than any other animals. And coming to the second part of your question, how this transmission occurs. So I do agree that bats carry, some species of bats carry some zoonotic viruses like Ebola, SARS, or Nipah. However, the transmission, the direct transmission from bats is very rare. So if you check the history of all these wild-originated zoonotic diseases, which could be originated from bats, if we see the history, we could see that fact, what I am telling, why bats are not directly involved in the transmission. I am trying to share my screen, but I don't know whether it's gonna work. This is the first time I am attempting this. So if you can see this, please drop in the comment box. Okay, so if I take you to the history, the Ebola virus disease outbreak, which is, we still don't know whether it's through the direct contact with reservoirs like apes or bats, or through bushmeat consumption. But the fact is that the recurrent outbreak of Ebola in the sub-Saharan area is because people brought bats to close to our human habitats through destroying their natural habitat, like deforestation, fragmentation, etc. And if we take the case of SARS, which are transmitted to humans from live markets, live animal markets, which are infected via captive civets. And another example is the Hendra virus, which the intermediate host was horses. And in the case of Nipah virus, we know that the first case was through the pig farms and consumption of bushmeat. And the recurrent occurrences in Bangladesh or West Bengal, what we are getting, is by drinking the unpasteurized palm juice or eating unwashed fruits. Again, that's something related with our behavior. And another example is MERS virus, which came from camels, and the virus jumped from bats like ages ago into camels and then finally come to humans. And as Uma rightly said, regarding the current situation, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the COVID-19 pandemic, we don't know exactly what is the causal organism, but scientists have isolated 96% genetically similar coronavirus in bats, one of the bat species. However, they diverge from the strain of the current coronavirus, which is causing or infecting humans around 40 or 70 years ago. So that means they can't directly come into contact with humans and thus causing this disease. So my point here is, what I am trying to convey is that there is always either an intermediary place or intermediate host plays a role by taking the diseases from wild to humans, or moreover, our own activities such as habitat fragmentation or bushmeat consumption involving in live markets, illegal trade, has put ourselves into the stressful situation. So the take-home message is, yes, bats, some species of bats, they carry zoonotic viruses, but so do in many other animals. And second is the spillover or the transmission from any other wild animals is a byproduct of human interventions or activities. Yeah, I know that that's a long answer, but I hope people could follow me.
Thanks, Parvathy. So let's go back to Uma now. And Uma, you already mentioned some of this in the beginning, but could you give us an evolutionary perspective to why bats are reservoirs for so many viruses? Parvathy did mention some of this herself. Many of these viruses don't really infect these bats, so could you talk about this?
Yeah, so I think it's a very curious thing, right? And something which I think we don't really know the answer to yet. But from what we understand, and this is just kind of something, this is a field which is really growing now in terms of our understanding, because the thought is that flight is very expensive, it's very costly, and energetically it's so costly that it generates a lot of what are called reactive oxygen species. These are compounds that degrade DNA, cause DNA damage, and basically kind of cause aging in a sense. They can cause you to age faster. That's what happens when people age, is you have a lot of this reactive oxygen species which cause damage and can cause cell death and so on. So somehow, if this were to happen in bats, every time they flew, they would start living for very, very short periods of time. Right? They would probably die very young. But we know that actually bats live pretty long, given their body size, compared to a rodent, or a small mammal. Rodents die very fast, right? 1 year, 2 years maybe. But bats live for much longer time for the same body size. So somehow they have evolved this ability to kind of be resistant to these reactive oxygen species. And one way is they kind of have a suppressed immune system. So they're not, reacting immunologically to a lot of things. And what happens, for example, in us is we have an immediate immune reaction when we have, say, a new virus or something that comes in. So because of this, bats actually are able to harbor a lot of viruses. This is the thought, especially for intracellular pathogens which come into cells, and they're able to harbor them, and basically, they don't seem to be affected by them substantially. So this is what people think. And so there are now a lot of studies going on where people are comparing, bat cell lines to human cell lines and so on, and trying to understand whether this is true from a mechanistic perspective. This is just an idea, right? So also, I think we should remember that a lot of times, I think we sometimes think that pathogens are host specific. They only infect specific hosts. There's one pathogen for humans and there's another one for chimps or something like that. But that's not really true. The more we learn about pathogens, we see that there are actually several of them. For example, coronaviruses are pretty good at infecting many different kinds of species, right? We know, for example, with SARS-CoV-2, it can actually cause infections in cats and to a lesser extent in dogs, but of course in macaques and monkeys and so on. So I think what happens is that when we talked about this, exposure, bats are harboring all of these viruses, and there are points in time when they suddenly shed them, right? And then if you happen to be around at that point in time, you would probably, they might spill over, right? They may spill over to humans, or in the case of MERS, they spilled over to to camels, and others as well. I think it's not, and I don't know. I know I don't want to sound against the kind of the dominant thing that we're hearing about, habitat loss. Yes, habitat loss does correlate with with emergence of diseases, but we have a lot of bats in urban areas too. It's not that the wet market is the first time that some human is encountering a bat, right? So I think that this is probably something which has been there for a long time. Bats have been shedding viruses. They've harbored a lot of viruses for millions of years. But it's just that the interface between humans and wildlife, whether it's in wet markets, whether it's hunting, whether it's habitat loss induced edges, has just increased so much more now. And there's so many more humans that we're seeing this a lot more than we did in the past. So the estimates are something like 75% of infectious diseases are now zoonoses. And I'm sure Mudassar can talk, or others, Prashanth can comment more on this. But I think from an evolutionary biology perspective, it's a really interesting puzzle to try and understand how is it. I mean, just think about it, right? This virus was there in some bat for really long, and now it's causing such havoc across the world, infecting so many people. So I think it's the reason for it being a pandemic, I think, is more social. That we have a different society now where, sorry, I should have quit my email, where we have a lot of movement and so on. And it's because of the human to human transmission. So we should not forget that. It's not that every time we're getting infected by a bat, right? So I think that for a successful pandemic, we need all of those elements: high infectivity, high ability to spread, and stay, for example, survive. The virus also survives for quite a long time, is active for quite a long time. So I guess from an evolutionary perspective, key evolutionary innovations would be necessary in the virus for it to jump hosts. Many species have many viruses we don't know about. We know very little about viruses and viral diversity. It's very undersampled, and that's why there are all these people like Virus Hunter, what's his name, Ethan Wolf, and so on, going off into caves or all over the world hunting viruses, as they're called. But I think that for something to be successful in another host, there has to be some kind of selection or some evolutionary events which allow that. And so probably I would say there's probably a lot of spillover going on. So for example, some of the work we did in Nagaland suggested spillover from bats of some other virus, some unknown virus. We don't know what it is, but no outbreak, right? So there may be a lot of spillover happening. We haven't studied it enough to know what spillover is not successful, so that we can identify which ones, when can we predict an evolutionary successful spillover event. Does that kind of answer your question?
That does. Thanks, Uma. That was really fascinating. So let's go back to Parvathy with a follow-up question. So just as it happened with the Nipah virus, there is a sudden paranoia surrounding bats now. When the Nipah outbreak took place, bats were culled because of this paranoia, and we're seeing a troubling repeat of this with COVID-19. The movie Contagion has also firmly planted in people's minds that bats are to be feared. And I hear people being very watchful over their shoulders when they go for walks in the evening now. So Parvathy, could you tell us why culling bats is not the answer to reducing our risk of disease outbreaks from bats and may actually be counterproductive?
Okay, so this is something related with what Uma has pointed out now. But let me bring you guys back to the point that I mentioned earlier, that I said in India, like many other parts, we've been coexisting with these bats for many years. And as Uma said, especially in the case of India or developing countries, our cities are expanding into the forest fragments or natural habitat of these animals. And we've been living with so many species, knowingly or unknowingly. I can see Rohit's name here. So I remember one of Rohit's talk when he got a bat detector, found a bats in his house somewhere hiding. So that's the way we've been coexisting with them. But unfortunately, the fact is that most of the people, like common public, we don't know much about these organisms. Like, we don't know about their lifestyle, where do they live, what bat species harbor, which type of viruses, whether they can directly transmit to humans or not, what do they eat, where do they live. So there are many research gaps involved and we don't know so many facts about them. But interestingly, what most of the people know about these bats, as you said, through films like Contagion or through misguided press releases during the pandemics. So I would cite one example. Recently, the ICMR has studied and they isolated 2 bat coronaviruses from 2 of the South Asian bat species. But the way press released the news is the presence of coronaviruses in bats, ICMR study reveals. So this can generate fear in people's mind, especially in this case, the ICMR study case. Actually, that bat coronaviruses that they isolated from that 2 bat species are not at all genetically similar to what is the causative virus for the COVID-19. So they don't harm that bat coronaviruses they recently isolated, doesn't do any harm to humans. But the way the fake news has flooded in WhatsApp or misguided information spread by media generate all this fear in public, and that can lead to the culling of bats from their cities or neighborhoods or the nearby banyan trees or things like that. So that is triggering the culling. And the answer, whether, as you said, culling is not actually the solution. Why I am saying that, I hope you remember when we have seen the history of the pandemics, we know that the direct transmission from bats, even in the case of Nipah, that's very rare. The bats don't come into our habitat. What we are doing, we go and encroach their world, or we bring them into ours, or we drag them into ours by destroying their habitat or just going to their roost or disturbing them. So since in all the cases, bats might be the original cause of a viral outbreak or disease outbreak, but they are not the causes for the direct transmission. And as Uma said, in all these cases, most of the outbreaks became pandemic through human-to-human contact. Even in the case of Nipah, like we do get recurring occurrences in Bangladesh or West Bengal. And statistics says that 78% of the deaths or the disease causing is from human to human. So in that way, culling of bats is not really controlling the chances of emergence of diseases. And the second point is, as I suggested, not all the bat species that we have around us could carry all these zoonotic viruses. So without knowing whether they can act as a host or they can directly transmit viruses to humans, without knowing that, if we go and just cull them, that can backfire us in a way, like when we stress these bat species, as Uma said, we don't know how many viruses they harbor. So suppose this imaginary situation, if you go them and distress them or stress them, there might be chances for the spillovers. So the best solution is just leave them in their habitats, don't go and disturb them, mind your business. And another point for why culling is not a good solution, I could recite an example from Peru, where vampire bats have been culled by people due to the fear that they can cause rabies. Those bat species were not at all responsible for rabies there in Peru. So what resulted in was that people have culled those bats which are very unlikely to spread these diseases. And coming back to this disturbances causing bats, which might lead to the spillover of diseases due to stress. One example is the Hendra virus outbreak in Australia. So people destroy the habitats, and the bats get stressed, and thus the virus spilled over from the little red flying foxes. So all these examples are telling us is that when bats are there in their natural habitat, they don't shed that much viruses, or rather we never exposed to situations like coming direct contacts with bats. So I think what we need here is the better understanding of the virology or viral association with bats, and we need to create awareness among people regarding all these things. And another point in that regard is that, as you mentioned, culling bats could be counterproductive. I will explain you how that can be counterproductive. One, as Uma rightly said, bats can new diseases or not. So we have this great source which we can use as a model organism to study, either to know the disease history or to develop vaccines and so on. So if we cull them unknowingly, we are losing that clue, that only clue towards the invention of vaccines or disease outbreak histories and things like that. And second is, I mentioned when I was answering my first question that these incredible organisms to human community, like for example, you may like tequila, right? So if bats are not there in Mexico or places like in South America or Central America, the tequila plants or agave plants couldn't get pollinated and regenerate. So we lost that. And another example is the durian from Southeast Asian countries, which bring a lot of money into those countries through the fruit selling. And again, if bats are not there, then no durian. So I'm mentioning the examples from all these countries, not from India. Why? Because we don't have many studies from India in that way. But I recently read one findings from the NCBS, and that people found out that bats can act as really good pest control in near Karnataka or Western Ghat region, where we have many tea plantations or coffee plantations. And they eat tons and tons of mosquitoes, mosquitoes can cause many other diseases. So they keep in check all these other organisms which can cause more lethality to human race. So what we need here is better awareness about bats, better public information, better understanding of their research or their viral activities or host things. So with all these, I think we can prepare for the next pandemic in the worst scenario.
Thanks. So you were mentioning about pest control, and there's actually an interesting study that was done in Western Ghats by Kadambari Deshpande and others, where they interviewed some farmers and they were asking about what they perceive are the benefits provided by bats. And these farmers were actually able to provide quite an accurate estimate of how much these bats provide them in terms of pest control and pollination services.
Okay, cool. So, anyway, thanks for the information.
But like Uma and Parvathy mentioned, bats are not the only reservoirs of viruses. So let's now turn to Mudassar. Could you please tell us about some India-specific zoonotic diseases and their reservoirs?
Yeah. So am I audible? So you can hear me, yeah. So hi everyone. Thanks Anisha for having me for this important discussion. So yes, so I'll try to maybe maybe try to slightly shift the focus from bats to maybe other reservoirs also, like because the focus is always now because of the coronavirus we always talk about bats. Like just to briefly say what's currently the emerging infectious diseases, what they say is zoonotic diseases. They are 60% are zoonotic, but out of that 60%, you have around 70% which are of wildlife origin. That's the main concern. So, and the one important thing I'd like to say here is in terms of the terminologies what we use, right? So when we say reservoir, so it can be it can be any wildlife reservoir, or maybe it can be domestic reservoir, and also it can be environment, or it can be in vector, right? So, and there is one there's a lot many definitions which have come up in past, and people have argued about what exactly it means a reservoir, whether it comes down with the disease or not, like it can maintain the infection or it can have very mild infection. There's lot many discussion going on that. So like what basically they say in terms of to be a reservoir host, it should be connected, more epidemiologically connected with the populations or environments in which the pathogen can maintain, and from which the infection can be transmitted to its target population. Here the target population is mostly humans, right? So that's very important, like the connectivity between the populations or the environment, so that where both the reservoir host and the target population are living together. So that's one thing. And what I'll just try to say one statistics, what it says, what Uma was trying to say. So, all the pathogens, it's not like only the origin is always from, the wildlife or the domestic one. Like there are common pathogens, like the main importance of the pandemic potential viruses is, they can infect multiple hosts, right? So one data, what it shows, this talks about all, it's maybe bacterial, viral, or parasitic, or any disease. So what they say is about 39% of the human pathogens can infect domestic animals, and the around 43% can infect wildlife host, and around 26% can infect both domestic and wildlife. So like this kind of mixing of this common the wide range of hosts getting affected with the pathogens. It's not like only one way transmission, right? Always we have in the got many pathogens in the environment. So I'll just maybe try to show one data what it says about the what are the different reservoir hosts. First I'll talk about that, then I'll maybe take few examples for the India specific zoonosis. So yeah, just share my screen. So if you can just see this, hope the screen is visible, right? So this particular is not very updated on the percentage, maybe more or less it will be not very much. So you have this list, the bat comes in the last. Definitely it has the potential in terms of what Uma was trying to say in terms of the potential of human to human transmission, right? Once the bat virus spills over from bats, there's one point is always we have to remember, when you talk about bats and the spillover, there's always some bridge host kind of thing. There's not direct transmission between bats and human. It's very rare that happens actually. You need some bridge host, which can some mammal or some domestic or wildlife species, then it can spill over to humans. Like you have highlighted these very important reservoirs in terms of, because why I have highlighted these rodents, primates, and bats, because these are very important reservoir for RNA viruses, which has the potential for causing pandemic outbreaks, and causing, maybe also leading to human transmission. So this is what the data, maybe it's not many, still not many papers might have come after that. So this is what the reservoirs status of different hosts which can be act as a reservoir. I'll take few examples which we are working on, few diseases on the example. Like I'll take one of Japanese encephalitis. What happens in that is like you have these wild like birds, especially these waterfowl and egret species of birds and mosquito and the these things. Virus always is maintained in this particular cycle. So in this you have your pigs as an amplifying host. Like people talk, as I was talking about this, difference between what's an reservoir host versus maybe an amplifying host. So then you get the maybe humans. And the one important aspect is again because of there is no much of human-to-human transmission here. So I'm trying to give some examples. Try to shift the not try to shift because right now the focus everybody is talking about the coronavirus. Like because in terms of preparedness, we need to understand other pathogens, other other viruses or other family of viruses which can spill over. And maybe I'll not go into the details of the transmission because of the maybe quite heterogeneous audience here. So in terms of host, we have these birds as an reservoir here. I'll take example of one environment example as anthrax. Like because we always talk about the either the host is a vector or maybe an animal, but here the more reservoir is an environment. The spores can survive in the environment for many years. There are many people say up to 100 years. So that's the cycle has been maintained so that the disease is getting transmitted in the endemic areas. So this is what like when there are environmental reservoirs, you get the disease in that area. Animals get the infection from the animals. You get human infections because either the handling of the animals or because consumption of meat or meat products. So the other disease which we are working on is as KFD. Like in this, a lot much is. We are doing the work on the Casanova forest disease. So there's not much research been done in the early 60s and 70s, and still there's not much clear information on which exact host act as a reservoir. They say small mammals can act as a reservoir host, but it's the virus is maintained in the vectors, especially the tick which maintains the virus. Otherwise, one important aspect of reservoirs is like you have the disease continuously happening. Like there is one aspect is when the disease becomes endemic in an area and you have the regular outbreaks of that particular disease. And the other is like what we talk about bats, what is circulating in the wild and which has the potential to spill over to the humans and become endemic, and you have the regular cycles of these infections. That is quite important in terms of this. What examples I'm taking, the diseases have been established in human population, and you're having the regular cycles of these outbreaks only because we have some reservoir, either it's maybe host, environment, or vector. And the other thing, I'll just with maybe not to deviate the topic, but just to give the audience one example, what happens when there is a reservoir and what happens when there is not a reservoir present. It's not a zoonotic disease, but this is which I work on. So I thought of giving an example of that. So this is what it happens, like you have a wildlife reservoir here, which is mostly some species of deer. And you have this vector, like it's a similar mosquito kind of vector, which is called Culicoides, and you have this domestic livestock. And you find this transmission taking place, and you have many outbreaks happening in India, particularly in South India. You have many outbreaks happening, and only because you have a reservoir host. Okay. There's one more disease, like which is of the same family. This particular blue tongue virus is in Rio virus. And the vector is also same. The Culicoides imicula is a vector for that, which is called African horse sickness virus. Blue tongue is there since 1980s till last year also. We had every year we'll get the outbreaks of blue tongue. But African horse sickness virus, I'll show you in the next slide. We don't have any African horse sickness virus in India since past 40 or 50 years, only because we don't have a wildlife reservoir, which is zebra, which act as a reservoir. So there is no African horse sickness virus. Whenever maybe we have more of zebra population, maybe imported, then we may get this disease. So that's when the importance of the reservoir host maintaining the infection in a population. So with that, maybe they will just quickly run through one example of maybe there are many diseases, KFD, rabies, H5N1, which is again is important in terms of the pandemic potential. There are very few reports of that. And again, the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus, there's no clinical disease reported in animals, but animals harbor the vectors, so that's the reason it's very important there. And not much studies have been done on the reservoirs, but people say it's mostly rodents there, and pigs maintain the virus in that. And other diseases, like we are always talking about the viral zoonosis, because if you talk about the pandemics, which like the plague and other things, were of bacterial origin. We should not forget always, always talking about the viral zoonosis. We have many bacterial zoonoses which are endemic in India, like anthrax, brucellosis, leptospirosis, and salmonellosis. And this one important aspect I want to show in this slide is, it's not only the animals, only humans getting the infection. Like animals do suffer with these diseases, right? So they get the infection from either from environment or from some other wildlife reservoir. They get the disease and they also pass on to the humans. So this is very important dynamics in terms of, it's not, and when you talk about in terms of culling or those kind of practices, it's not at all a viable option. If you ask me, like, in terms of if you talk of the livelihood of people dependent on these livestock population, right? So I'm not even going to touch about the rickettsial or parasitic zoonosis, because I'm just listing out these diseases. So the point of showing that was to, in terms of to say that, like, so we have many endemic zoonotic diseases to look after, and there are many reservoir hosts for that, and we need systematic studies to look into this zoonosis. I think it's the right time because of the coronavirus. People are talking about zoonosis, right? So we always discuss these issues. Like, there are not many endemic diseases which are there in India, and we need to do much more than what we are doing now, right? So I think hope that kind of summarizes the reservoir host point.
Thank you so much, Mudassar. It was really interesting to see marine mammals as one of the reservoirs for zoonotic diseases.
I didn't touch that, because you didn't want to go there. That's again very important point. Yeah.
Okay. So let's now step back a bit. India, like other tropical countries, has had a long history of dealing with zoonotic diseases. And the Kyasanur forest disease that Mudassar mentioned, it crosses from ticks to people in the Western Ghats of India. And this came to the attention of researchers in the 1950s. So Prashanth, could you tell us about how public and government perceptions towards zoonotic diseases has evolved over the years since then?
Yeah, sure. I think, if I'm allowed to take a few further steps back,
sure.
I wanted to just emphasize on a point that I think Uma mentioned earlier, that be it pandemics or any of these diseases, especially with zoonosis, the social and economic dimensions are often missed, because a lot of the immediate first information that we get is on the biomedical aspects of the disease, the mutations, the strains, the diagnostics, and all of the really biological element clouds out, I think, the important wider socio-economic factors that are also very important in driving these events. Like, even if you take, for example, land use change, one of the important primary drivers of land use change is also because of macroeconomic phenomena, in terms of the kinds of resource extraction that is needed to sustain the pace of economic and various other development that happens. So I just wanted to emphasize that we must discuss zoonosis also within that wider understanding of globalization and macroeconomic pressure, which in turn drive our need for resources, and which in turn are also drivers of land use change and other risks which cause and bring about these zoonosis. And the second aspect is of a need for a systems view, I think, and it's increasingly becoming evident. Even if you take diseases like rabies, or if you take diseases like the Kyasanur forest disease, which Mudassar mentioned earlier, the first thing we think of is not to cull or remove the specific animal which is causing. For example, for rabies, the solution is not that we get rid of all dogs. That will not get rid of rabies. And that is not dealing with zoonotic diseases, because these are occurring within a system, and we need to understand the entire system that is within which these species and vectors are merely a context for these illnesses. I think I was trying to emphasize that we need to have a systems view, and we need to understand that removing one particular, what we call quote unquote problem species, is not the way to be dealing with any zoonotic disease, because these specific species are merely contexts for pathogens to travel and do what they always do, which is to survive. So with that background, I think if I respond to your question on how we have been dealing with in India with infectious diseases, I think one landmark kind of a program that we have is something called as the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program, the IDSP program, which tracks a specific list of priority infectious diseases. And this has been the most important way in which the health system has kept sort of a watch over various patterns of illnesses in different parts of the country. The program itself has various issues which are related to capacity, building capacity, and having trained manpower in many places, in maximizing sort of detection of these diseases in areas where we have very limited health workforce. So various issues of that sort. But in terms of whether we have a good system to be able to detect infectious diseases early and then mobilize a response, I think the IDSP program is one of the programs of the health department which is there. But maybe one important thing to discuss, something that Mudassar brought up, is the fact that we do not have a One Health kind of an approach. So the IDSP program largely tracks human health, and within the veterinary department, there are initiatives to track animal health and animal diseases. And the forest department and wildlife research organizations, there does not seem to be a specific unit or wing within our forest establishment which tracks and produces sort of long-term surveillance and understanding of pathogens traveling between wild species and domestic species, or wild species and human beings. So I think one of the most important gaps there is the lack of an integrated surveillance across these to keep it in an interaction or follow-up.
Thanks, Prashanth. And I really wish we could talk longer about the socioeconomic factors when it comes to land use change and zoonosis. And we'll also be talking more about One Health toward the end of this discussion.
So, Anisha, if you permit one further remark on that, on the land use change component, one thing I notice which is problematic whenever we talk of what is really driving zoonotic disease has been to pick on the weakest link in the chain. We often pick on people who happen to be having the highest interface with forests. Typically, these are forest-associated communities, individuals. But we forget that there is a huge economic enterprise built around, for example, the need for highways cutting across forests, the need for rare minerals and metals, which are typically in areas with high forests. So I think we need to keep that perspective in mind, that a lot of these drivers indirectly are located in our cities. If we want the kind of economic development in cities, a lot of that has to come from land use change. And so we need to keep that in mind while we are often talking of, I mean, I'm not saying hunting wildlife is a good thing, but the person who is hunting wildlife for individual consumption is not the biggest quote unquote villain, so to speak, as much as large corporations, for example, or people like us who need a certain kind of amenities that can only be sustained through resource extraction.
Thanks, Prashanth. I think we should definitely have a longer talk on this subject. But let's continue about what you were talking about land use change and habitat fragmentation. And let's turn towards Uma now and delve a little bit deeper into ecosystem health and its links with zoonotic diseases. So as both Parvathy and Uma mentioned earlier, habitat fragmentation, which is the process of large natural habitats such as forests or grasslands, getting transformed into smaller patches that are isolated from each other, is one of the primary causes of emerging zoonotic diseases. So Uma, could you tell us about the converse of this, and could you also tell us some more details about what you were mentioning about increased contact with wildlife because of edges? And also, where does India stand when it comes to ecosystem health and the risk of future outbreaks?
Thanks, Anisha, and thanks. It's been really nice listening to everybody else. So I think that, very quickly, when we started talking about this, we said there are three correlates. That is, high land use change, high human population density, and high biodiversity. And we quickly glossed over that because we want to be careful that no one picks on that and says, well, as Parvathy was trying to say, culling, let's just eliminate the biodiversity and that should take care of the problem, right? So I'm just going to say it out there because that's something which, of course, we don't even want to think about, right? But, let's think about it scientifically. Is that an option? Or apart from the ecosystem services, right? Forget about the ecosystem services that these different species render. Would we have less risk of disease emergence? Should we completely eliminate biodiversity? So I think even for that, the answer is no. There are several theories and hypotheses. One which is a really long-standing one is called the dilution effect, which suggests that when you have high biodiversity, you may actually have fewer net pathogens. It's only in these kind of recently assembled communities. So when I talked about edge, so suppose you take a plantation in the Western Ghats, right? Now you may have a plantation where you have tea, and then you have some recovering degraded forest, and then you have right next to it Kudremukh or something like that. So in that kind of a situation, the community of say small mammals or bats that lives in Kudremukh is different from that which lives in a tea plantation or which lives in say agricultural fields or something like that. So when you have these small parcels of land which have landscapes which have different communities of species, and these communities are then pushed together, sometimes you have what's called a non-analog community, a new community which is created, assembled from all of these different habitats. And depending on ecological filters, some species are generalists, they do well, others are not able to survive in degraded habitats or habitats with fewer fruit trees or something like that. So in that sense, you create these new communities, and this is where spillover actually tends to happen the most. The probability of spillover is highest when you have a new pathogen encountering a new host which it has not seen before. That said, I don't think this has been very rigorously tested. There are many studies from across the world where someone looked at pathogen diversity in this biodiversity context, and someone else looked somewhere else. But what would be really nice is if we could actually say, let's look at say a diversity gradient like the Western Ghats. The Southern Western Ghats has higher species richness or more mammal diversity, whereas the Northern Western Ghats has less. We also have gradients of land use change and human diversity. Can we actually decouple the effects of biodiversity, land use change, as well as human population density? So I know it sounds like when you ask a researcher a question, they always say, oh, well, we need to do more research. And maybe that's how this sounds. But I think it's true that we do need to understand this is a very rough thing to say, oh yes, it's dependent on these things, but how and why? What situations minimize the chance of spillover, right? So can we then design landscapes that would minimize spillover? This would be really applied and useful, thing to infer from such research. There's also just to before, because I don't want to leave people with that sentiment of eliminating biodiversity. There are other studies and models which show that if you eliminate biodiversity entirely or have just one species like a monoculture, like that you just had one species of bat or one species of rodent, you do tend to have much higher densities and you could have higher spillover. These are models by Dobson and others, but they suggest that you do need some kind of a diverse community to kind of minimize risks of spillover. All of that said, I still think that when spillover happens is not a very predictable event, and we would really need a lot more local data. Like when might it happen in the Western Ghats, given the kinds of land use change, given the distributions of densities of people, given the use of the land and so on. So I feel like these broad studies do tell us, they hint at parameters which are important, but is something we need more on the ground data for to address. But I think that's, maybe this demonstrates my lack of knowledge, but that's how I've understood it.
Thanks, Uma. And I hope the researchers amongst the audience actually do go out and test the relationship between biodiversity and zoonotic outbreaks. Okay, so I don't think we need to take a break because we're not that far. I thought it will be 1.5 hours before we start taking a break. But anyway, so I'd like to end this discussion with a note on One Health that Prashanth began to talk about. So One Health is a recent collaborative approach towards zoonosis. Its goal is to recognize the interconnectedness between human health, wildlife, domestic animal health, and the environment. Mudassar and Prashanth are actually collaborators on one such One Health project, which focuses on the Kyasanur forest disease that they mentioned. So Mudassar and Prashanth, it would be great if you could each tell us a little bit about your research under One Health, and also about how the pieces of ecology, evolution, veterinary sciences, and public health fit in the larger puzzle of zoonotic diseases and environmental health. And also, could you please talk about the urgency for increased multidisciplinary research going forward? And I request Uma to join in here as well.
Prashanth, you want to go first? Then I'll join, maybe add on.
Sure. Am I audible this time, Anisha?
Yeah, you're audible.
Then I request Mudassar to take over. So I think this is really the way forward, and this is, I think, at the heart of what we should characterize as a systemic response. What I would characterize, to use a strong word, as a stupid response is to say, okay, we identify one problem species and we remove it from the system. That's typically not a way of thinking systemically about an issue as complex as pandemics of this sort. So I think one of the ways of thinking about it systemically is to understand disease dynamics and get to a place possibly where we can have some ability to foresee some of these events, to be better prepared for some of these events. And at the heart of that is to at least set up, identify potential interfaces, typically forest and human interfaces, and begin to prioritize and study zoonotic disease patterns. And there are, I mean, COVID is not the first. Like Mudassar has shown, there are so many other zoonotic disease models that we actually do not understand very well. To take one example of the Kyasanur forest disease, which was so limited and for which still human-to-human transmission is not known, has increased in geographical expanse across several states now. Yeah, and some of the work that Mudassar, me, and many other collaborators are doing has shown that a lot of this has to do with the rapidity at which we are changing landscapes, and hence creating newer ways of exposing human populations to newer kinds of pathogens. And these are all for us currently what we call in systems thinking as unknown unknowns. We do not know what we do not know. Yeah. So I think this is the time to be setting up what we called One Health surveillance sites, which involve strong collaborations between public health people, epidemiologists and such, veterinary professionals, wildlife and ecology professionals, working together, not only in terms of the research dimensions, but also in terms of the sectors, the action. Just to give you one example, the veterinary department does its own disease surveillance currently, and the human health department has its own surveillance apparatus. And each of these departments separately respond to outbreaks. I'm not saying that there is absolutely no data sharing. It's not like these are done in secret, but by design, there is no collaborative action built into these. And if I bring in the forest department into this, that's another long story, because the kind of technical, we've looked at forests as a management enterprise, not so much as a space where technical expertise and research has to be built in, I feel. And of course, I'm not qualified to comment on this, but I'm speaking as an outsider. So these three sectors need to also come together in order to guide action. And that these are the kind of systemic kind of responses we need to be moving towards, rather than sort of talking of identifying specific problem species and thinking of removing them and such. With this, maybe I will pass on to Mudassar.
Yeah, I think you have covered most of the aspects of One Health research. I'll just try to maybe add on what Prashanth has already said, in terms of one need to understand that, like, why it is not happening also, right? So because we have so many players in that, and as Prashanth was saying, that doesn't come into picture at all. Like there are many aspects, and somewhere I also feel that we cannot, unless there is some policy in place, we also cannot blame the different departments, because if you take an example of Casno forest disease as such, because I remember trying to get contact to people since 2009 to work on this disease, right? It was slightly difficult task, because for me to work on Casno forest disease is not much of importance for animal health point of view, because animals do not come down with the disease. There is no burden of that disease in animals. If you ask my funders, anybody want to work on KFD may not be a priority for them. Like, so as Prashanth said, that like we need to have some kind of mechanism, have some system in place, so that we work on One Health kind of approach involving every sector in that. So I'd like to add one more dimension here in terms of how we approach One Health issues. Like as I said in my previous discussion, like one is, we have endemic set of diseases. How you approach those diseases in a One Health framework. You have your effective surveillance mechanism, so that you detect early, and try to contain the outbreak. Maybe if it is in animals, you try to prevent this spillover to humans, right? A typical example for it comes to me, because working on anthrax since some time. So, like one kind of approach which we follow for diseases which are endemic. And next, coming to the point of, in terms of our emergency preparedness point of view, like, you say, people talk about the India being a hotspot for many zoonotic diseases. And in that point of view, like if you want to really work on the future pandemics, possibility of having pandemics from India, so then we need a slightly different approach, as maybe Parvathy was also trying to point out. I also completely agree with that point, is not to have, disturb the even the habitat of these any species for that matter, and not name any, because to handle those, and you're trying to risk that, you need to have some effective surveillance mechanism, more of non-invasive approaches. You can do many ways in that way. So that, like you try to have do research, have your preparedness in place, but at the same time, not to do too much of, because coronavirus, everybody try to work on bats and try to catch the bats and try to do it. That's also increases risk of, spill over there. So we need to have a balanced approach in that, in terms of having One Health approach for zoonotic diseases. So we cannot, people always talk about, people working in silos, we don't collaborate. There are issues with that, because of late, since 2009 pandemic H1N1, there is a lot of discussions going on. At least there's cross-table meetings happening. But I think we need to have, I always talk about this differentiation between endemic and pandemic. Like you have endemic disease, you need to deal it differently. And the pandemic is, if you call so-called research and finding out new viruses, or maybe having your surveillance in place, so that you detect very early and prevent the spillover. So I think, yeah, that's it from my side. Just maybe quickly, yeah, that should be fine. Yeah, you can add on.
Add, so on Friday, which is the 22nd of October, there was International Biodiversity Day, and MOEFCC hosted a webinar where they proclaimed that this is a big priority for them. One Health is something which they really want to do in the future, to fund, to support, to encourage. At the same time, the ICMR, Indian Council for Medical Research, whom we hear about every day in the newspapers and on TV these days, has already initiated a One Health Institute in Nagpur. So these are all fine, but basically, I think it's a conceptual framework, and I think there are issues with working at this kind of a interdisciplinary level in India, where we either have a lot of people. I mean, I'm talking from the academic perspective. So we have a lot of people who do, maybe not a lot, but some people are interested in fundamental research. Others, what are called so-called application-oriented. But One Health will really require, both fundamental research as well as application, interdisciplinary. So we're talking about collaborations which are of a large nature. And I think this might be a bit of a hurdle, though everyone agrees we need a One Health approach. There's no one who says, no, we shouldn't have One Health, right? But implementation is going to be, I mean, it's a challenge we should take up. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but it is going to be challenging, especially given the context in India today. There's something else I wanted to say, but I don't remember now, so that's fine.
Thanks, Uma. Thanks for raising some of those challenges. And I also want to add that Unknown Unknowns would be a great name for a longer talk about One Health. Right, so as we close today's discussion, I'm sure the panelists have impressed upon all of you that human health is connected in very complex ways to the health of the environment, wildlife, and domestic animals. So we're actually going to have a part 2 of this discussion. We're going to be taking a deep dive into environmental health in India, specifically focusing on habitat fragmentation, and we'll release the date of this discussion in the coming weeks. So do stay tuned. You can subscribe to our mailing list by emailing cafeoikos.blr@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter or Instagram. We're at Cafe Oikos. So before we take questions, I want to say a huge thank you to Parvathy, Mudassar, Uma, and Prashanth for being part of this discussion and making it so informative. And also thank you to everyone who tuned in today. And thanks to Manini Bansal for making the really nice poster.